good to hear all the chatter, but we're a couple of minutes behind, but it's a beautiful day. It's nice to see the sunshine, and we get reminded every now and then in February these cold fronts come through, but they last a day, and the next day is real pretty, and luckily we got that today. It's nice to see. I don't know if you've noticed the birds are singing, so it's always nice to hear the birds start to anticipate spring. Spring's my favorite time of the year. And before we begin class, does anything need to be added to the bulletin? I would say that Terry mentioned McMaster that keep Samantha York in your prayers, please. She's really battling COVID. So keep her on your prayers. Yeah. Which family is that again? Barnwell, yeah. Yeah. Keep the Barnwell family mentioned, please. He's a young man with cancer, and it's a terrible thing. So keep that family in your prayers, please. Yeah. Keep Judy in your prayers, please. She had hand surgery this last week, and I don't know if you noticed Clayton, but he went and saw his dermatologist. Looks like he got beat up pretty good. So every time he sees her, she puts a good one on him. She's like John Wayne in the Old West when she hits you with that freeze gun. So, anything else? Okay. Clayton, would you lead us in a prayer, please?
Thank you, Father, for the opportunity you give us to come together. Thank you, Father, for the preparation that Dan has made and for the class. We pray that we'll listen and we'll understand the words that he teaches, that we know that from your word. Strengthen our efforts, Father, to learn more of the word every day, and not only to learn it, but to put it in our lives. And help us, Father, to be here one for another and find strength one with another, but most of all, to try to speak one with another is also we can. Thankful for the opportunities we have to meet together on the Lord's Day, to study your word, to worship you, and give you our praise. But most of all, we're thankful for what Jesus did for us by giving us the opportunity to do it for eternity. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. I will say just real briefly, we had such a good time last night. I know some were busy with other things as well, but for those that showed up and was able to enjoy one another's company, it was such a nice evening. And which reminds us, fellas, tomorrow is kind of a big day. Don't forget what tomorrow is. You don't want to end up on the short end of that. So before we move on, I did want to make one more point that we went through things last week pretty quickly. I'm trying to keep the pace up, but if you'd turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, we got to the end of really as this passage comes to a close of verse 10, if you were to break chapters up, that would have been a good place to put a chapter break. That really brings to a close Peter's kind of introduction to the Christians that he's writing to. And you'll remember in verse 9, that's what I wanted to focus on, one last point that I overlooked. It's an important point. But you're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. And this is the point, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. You know, we went through the significance of that royalty that we are, the holy nation that we are, the special prized people that we are. But that doesn't mean a thing if we don't do what follows that, which is to proclaim that our God is our God. If we don't live lives that proclaim that. And if we don't actively go out into a lost world and proclaim that, and we're told to explicitly in other passages we well know, Matthew chapter 28, 19 and 20, and various other passages give us explicit instruction that we are to go and to go into a lost world. But Peter puts it in a very well said way here, that as we are that chosen generation, and as we are a royalty of his, basically, in a priesthood, that holy nation, a special people, that we should proclaim to those that are around us. And I've said it many times, and we should live lives. It's very easy for people around us to see who we are. And we do and have talked about that being the case, that many times as we just live our lives, we come across people that we know that there's something different about them. And so we do see it. But I just say that to beg the point, if we don't, who will? If we don't, who will? So it is ours to do. So that kind of closes this passage, and we'll pick up with verse 11. But as we break this passage up, I'd like for us to be mindful of a few things. Be mindful that Peter now has commended the brethren for the choices of their salvation, that they have been redeemed. And I'm going to use some R's because sometimes I put things together in formats that I can remember them. But they are the redeemed, and they have been saved, and their salvation is valuable. And with rewards, as we're going to find out in verse 11 and following, where there are great rewards, there are also great responsibilities, great requirements. So that's what we're going to walk into in verse 11. So we're going to leave the passage that Peter's brought them to in terms of the great reward that they have, the encouragement that he's offered to maintain that, keep it, don't change. But then he does go into verse 11 then, and actually we made it down to that point last week. So here we're going to enter into the responsibilities that are expected, or you might say requirements as well, of the Christian. So verse 11, and we'll go actually, I'm going to go down through verse 17. Hope we might be able to make it through the end of the chapter, but we'll see. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that, whereas they speak evil against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Verse 13, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as to them that are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So let's back up to verse 11. You notice the first thing that he enters in here, and that's why I say it is a very good breaking point from what he said before. He's beseeching. When he says beseeching, he's drawing these brethren in that he's writing to. The beseeching literally means stand beside me. And he's about to admonish them, but very gently. So that's a very nice way to say, let's talk about something. And as he goes into this whole list of, and we'll go down through a fair part of chapter 3 is really passages of submission, submitting in various different ways. And so he's going to talk about submission. And I don't know about you, but anytime someone starts talking to me about submission, I don't really like the thought, right? I mean, it's just something that just isn't something that I just am naturally drawn to. I tend to fight things. I tend to be independent. I tend to do things on my own. I tend to have that characteristic and personality. So, and I don't think it's unusual. I think that's fairly common for a lot of us, that we like to be our own and do our own thing and have that personality from the standpoint. And especially maybe it's just part of our culture here in the Ozarks, that we're just this independent-minded group that wants to do our own thing. Well, that may be fair and good, but when it comes to when we've submitted to Christ, Peter's also bringing this in, that we have other obligations and responsibilities as he's leaving the great rewards that we have. So he brings them in. Dearly beloved, stand next to me. Let's talk about a few things here. And it's a gentle admonishment, if you will, because as they are in, as he says here, strangers and pilgrims. Now, they're strangers and pilgrims passing through, literally, but also figuratively. It applies to us just the same. We sing a song, "This world is not my home. We're just a passing through. And the angels beckon me somewhere beyond the blue." And that applies to them, certainly, but it also applies to us today. This world is not our home. And so in that, as he writes to them, certainly he's bringing them to his side and starting to give them some instruction from the standpoint of submitting. And so as he does that, he wants them to take a listen, because it is definitely different than what he was talking about before. Abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul. Let's take a look at Galatians. Now, Paul writes about this too. Look at Galatians chapter 5. It probably says it a little bit more clearly. In verse 16 of chapter 5, and there's a parallel thought here from the standpoint of from Peter and what Paul mentioned in this passage. "This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusteth against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary one to the other, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would. But if ye be led by the Spirit, or of the Spirit, ye are not under the law." So, and that's a truth that we should recognize. We do recognize, I believe, as Christians, that there is a war going on, a spiritual war. Peter goes more into detail later on in chapter 5 about that war, but here he clearly points it out, that there is a war going on. So he doesn't expand too much on abstain from fleshly lusts, but there's numerous fleshly lusts that he could have said. Name a few. Name a few fleshly lusts.
Paul did a pretty good job. He named it works of the flesh.
Works of the flesh, yeah. Carnal desires, those things that we want to do from what we see, or the pride of life, or all the things that Satan tempts us with from that standpoint, are lusts of the flesh. Maybe that we misprioritize things. Maybe we want those things that are physical and we put spiritual things aside to obtain them. I mean, you can go down the list. The list is extensive. It certainly would apply with immorality. Anything of the immoral lusts that are out there certainly qualify. So Peter just kind of keeps it in a nutshell for here. Abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul. And so, as Paul said in Galatians 5, It's one or the other. We're either spiritual and we're pursuing spiritual interests and we see the plan that God has for us and we understand that and we pursue it, or we don't. I mean, you can't have it both ways. And so we know that.
About Romans 7, where Paul says, why do I do the things that I do when I know I shouldn't be?
Yeah, I know.
So why don't I do the things that I should be doing? And then a funky himself to bring in the chapter. Oh, wretched man.
Yep. And how many times have we found ourselves saying that? How many times have you, man, I knew better than that, you know? And it is the shortcomings that we have as people, as human, as fallibility, as, you know, sometimes we know and we still find ourselves falling short, missing the mark, as we say. Yep.
I know you said later, free but not free.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that in old law, they had a lot of things that just about every step of your life, they had a law.
Oh, yeah.
And now basically you're under your own power.
Mm-hmm.
Your own, I don't know how to say that right now, but anyway, it's you yourself that are correcting yourself. It's
Mm-hmm.
not the law.
Mm-hmm.
It's the word that's in your heart. It's the love that you have for God that's doing the correcting
Yeah.
in your walk.
Yep.
And that's why you have this war now, in you.
That's a good point. Yeah.
That's a good point. But you know what he's telling us? Because that, when we're in this life, you know what? All of a sudden, my car is important to me, my house is important to me, my business is important to me. There's a different point of view he's trying to get us to say.
Mm-hmm.
Like we crawled the hot air balloon, and we went up there a mile above the sky to go down, see my little bitty house, and see my little bitty car.
Mm-hmm.
You know what? It means nothing.
It means nothing. It's going to burn one of these days.
It means nothing.
Nothing.
He said, no, so we need to quit thinking about the physical things and really start thinking about the spiritual things that are really important.
Yep, that's a good point. And kind of go back to the point, you said something that kind of triggered my thought about, you know, the old law was called our what? Our schoolmaster. And so being in that law, bringing us to a new law now, which we're going to talk about, is we have submitted ourselves to a new law. And yes, it is by our own free will choice. And that's what submission is. By that free will choice, that will has become our will. And that's what submission is. And so, yeah, and in that, like a schoolmaster, kind of like a child, that discipline that it offered then is to, as you discipline a child, it's not a parent all the time right there making them do that. It becomes theirs as they become adults, that they now are self-govern their behavior as their parent has brought them up. And so it's kind of the same thing in our Christian walk. Yes, we have that schoolmaster that's taught us an imperfect will. It was imperfect in a few ways, bring us to a perfect will of Christ. That now that is what we've come into. But that's a really good point, and I hadn't thought about that, but I appreciate you making that. So that's the war that we have, though. A spiritual war and a physical war. Those fleshly lusts, that carnal life that's, you know, temporally minded versus an eternally minded redemptive plan of the spiritual that we have chosen. And in verse 12 says, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, that they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Now when it says here, the Gentiles, it's really not speaking of that race at this point. Peter's really referencing something that Jews often talked about. You know, Gentiles were also pagan. or foreign or sinners, and they had that, term that just represented that. And that's what he's talking about here, a formal life, that they've left behind. Having your conversation, that your conduct now is not sinful, not like it was before, that it's not the life that you've left behind. That having your conversation honest among the world, that you've left that you've left it behind, and now you have a honest conduct. And the honest conduct, the word, if you look at it, is a good, moral, upright life. Just that honest conversation, that honest conduct that we should live. And then it's so honest and it's so good and it's so moral and it's so evident, really, in a world that's not, that even though the world speaks against you, that they see that your conduct isn't what they're saying. So there's, a split there between what they're seeing and what they're saying. Even they know that it's a disparaging comment, accusation. Yeah.
A lot of times the world is looking for a cheat in our
Oh, they are. And why?
right. So if they know you're Christian, and they see you daily,
Mm-hmm.
they're looking for that fallible
Yes.
that will justify their themselves.
And that's the why. Yep. Yeah, it's a very good point. And I've noticed that for for my life. I've noticed, because I've been blessed to be raised in the church and a Christian for a very long time. Forever that I can remember, and I'm sure it's the same for others as well, the world notices what we do. They notice what we do. And I've heard it and I've seen it that, well, did you see so-and-so? He was parked out in front of the liquor store. You've heard it, I've seen it, I've heard it. We see it. They notice it. And why do they notice it? Because they like to go to the liquor store. Well, if we're doing it and they're doing it, after all, we're Christian, right? Then they compare themselves in a validating way because we're Christian. So our conduct is very, very important. It's invaluably important because they do notice. They do notice. And they've always compared themselves, the world, to us as Christians to validate themselves.
Now, the flesh is weak, but the spirit is strong. That's the truth of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
What did devil tempt Adam and Eve with, and you and me with, and Jesus with?
Yeah.
The physical.
Right.
The physical.
Right.
And we succumb to it.
And we will, and we do. And he knows what to use against us. I mean, everybody's is different. We've mentioned that in weeks past, that mine's not the same as Clayton's. Clayton's isn't the same as Steve's, and we all have weaknesses. And the devil knows exactly where to go. He leans on it because he doesn't have us. Now, when people start to say, well, boy, it's pretty easy, you better get really worried when that happens. Because the devil, if he has us, it becomes very easy. It becomes very, as I have kind of in my mind envisioned, to float down the river. Apathy starts to creep in. Complacency becomes to creep in. If it's easy, I become a little bit leery about, because it's not something that should be that easy. But I say that because the comparison that Peter puts out here, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak evil against you, that your good works, which they shall behold, glorifies God in the day of his visitation. So in the end, who's going to validate that Christian life? Our Heavenly Father, as He comes back and takes the church home, validates us, and they will see that. And they won't go into judgment, and many times I've often said that it's best to let people know now just exactly who we are, because I don't want them to be surprised come in Judgment Day that, can you believe he got in? Well, no, that's not the way it should be. We should proclaim our lives in such a way that they know we're going in. And it shouldn't be a surprise in the end. And that's what Peter's saying here is, whereas they speak evil against you, they know that what kind of people you are. And that you're God in the day of His visitation. There's no surprises. There's no surprises when He comes back.
There be no atheists in hell, will there?
No, there will not be. And that's a sad, sad thing. It's a sad, sad day for them. Points, comments, anything up to verse 13? Okay. In verse 13, so we get into then some passages of submission. And this kind of applies to us today, the first one, as we submit to government. I don't know about you, but that really doesn't really tickle my fancy any to think about that, because I see some of the things that go on, and it was a good reminder to me that we still have an obligation as Christians to submit. But let's lay out a couple of things here. Let's go to Matthew chapter 22 first. A couple of reminders of a couple of other instructions that go along with this very well. 22 and verse 21. And this is the Pharisees had presented Christ with a question. You know, what thinkest thou in verse 17? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? Well, as he says in verse 20, whose image and superscriptions on the coinage? And then verse 21, and they say unto him, Caesar's. And he saith unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So that's a principle that we need to build on. Turn over to Acts chapter 5. We've mentioned Peter and John and the apostles in the church as they went out teaching. You know, in really chapter 3, 4, and 5, they're reprimanded, they're brought before the council, they're let go, they're brought back. And look at verse 28. And saying, did not we straitly command you that ye should not teach in this name? And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. In verse 29, then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than man. So there's the balance that we really have between those two passages that Peter brings out here. You know, we have that obligation, as we'll get into, to our government, but who comes first? Our God. And Matthew chapter 6, verse 33 lays out the same thing. So keep those passages in your mind as we go down through what Peter says here. So let's look at submission. So to submit, as I mentioned, is to make one's will your will. Okay, so in all these passages we see submission. We'll get into submission in business and marriage and just life in general. So as we look at that, your will is becoming someone else's will is becoming your will. You're by choice making this your will. And that is the submission that we're talking about.
What's the main difference between submission and subjection?
Well, I haven't thought about that.
Submission is your choice.
Yeah.
You have to that way.
Being subject to, is that fair?
You become a slave.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 So the question was, what's the difference between submission and subjection? Being subject to, you sometimes don't have that choice as a slave might. Well, some slaves did have, which we'll get into, but some are subjected to it. They're taken captive and put into slavery. You don't have any choice about that. So some slaves may not, and they're subject then to their masters, subject, being in subjection to. So that's the difference. And as Christ, we've willfully subjected ourselves to Him, willfully chosen His will. His will has become our will, but it's our free moral choice that we've done that. Yeah. So as we do that and we put that into our lives, then that's some of the differences. Oh, I thought you had your hand. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking, we talk about that, anytime we talk about submission or subjection to one, always think about Daniel and Joseph as the prime examples. You know,
Yeah. Yep.
they were both slaves, but yet they still submitted because they
True.
because they done what God wanted them to do. You know, He received the glory, and He still took care of it.
That's a really good example. Joseph and Daniel are both good examples in the Old Testament of being subjected, but they understood that they still were able to submit, and up to a point, Daniel still prayed. He still went to the window. They knew it, and they used it against him, but he still did it. Didn't change anything that he did, but he was still submissive in terms of the remaining part of his life and service under that king. And so, same thing with Joseph, very much so, sold into slavery, had no choice in that, was subject, but yet led submissively in Potiphar's house, and actually rose up quite well because of his submissiveness. And so those are really, I appreciate you bringing those out, two good examples, because here, part of the reason that Peter is writing to the Christian at this time, because they were really kind of thinking about not being submissive. They had reasons not to be submissive. So as they're dispersed and as they're across the land subject to the Roman Empire, there was a really tempting thing not to be submissive. From the standpoint of their taxation, it was oppressive. The Roman taxation system, as the Roman Empire expanded, was purposely used against the ones that they overtook so they couldn't rise up against the empire. So it was a very oppressive taxation system. And from that standpoint, as they're trying to just live, there was an active thought of, well, just don't pay your taxes and keep it to yourself and support your family. We're in a terrible tribulation here. We have a terrible situation here. So that is part of the reason that Peter writes this to them, to remind them of their duty to be submissive to the government, no matter what it is, and that's what he says. But anyway, so that submissiveness here, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. For the Lord's sake. Okay, notice that. He reminds them of that. And whether it be to the king as supreme or to the governors as them that sent by him. So it's all under that person's authority, the king or the governors that are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. And notice again he says here, for so is the will of God, that with well-doing you might put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. So today, I think it's very applicable today, very, very similar in terms of it's a very tempting thing to not submit to our government. And we get tempted in many different ways here today. You can go down the litany of lists of ways that it would be easy to find a loophole, skirt the law. And yeah, taxation certainly comes up to the foremost. Unfortunately, it's very tempting to not render to Caesar what is Caesar's. It's very tempting. And I'd be very naive to say that as Christians that we don't look and say, well, the law allows me to do this. Well, if someone makes a very adequate sum of money and is very comfortable and does not render to Caesar what is Caesar's, then we have to be mindful of that as Christians. Christians, we have a duty to submit. And, you know, it's an interesting thing to look across time at different people. We was talking about it a little bit at supper last night, but as people, we tend to always look for loopholes. And you can look at, you know, various cultures and communities and peoples, and it just across time, if you look at the behavior that we have, we do tend to be looking for loopholes. We always look for how do I get around this? Or I think we was talking about Muslims last night that, you know, whereas, you know, they can't eat pork, and we was talking about Jews a little bit, and when they don't eat pork either. And well, if you just leave it on the table, there's certain groups that, well, you can't give it to them or that's a sin. And if you just lay it on the table and leave and don't look, then you'd be amazed how that pork disappears. And so it's weird how sometimes we find those loopholes around that thinking. And certainly our government today makes the Roman government look small in comparisons to administration. There's more laws today. I mean, we can't even count the laws. I mean, we could count the laws under the old law of Judaism. You know, there's 660 Rick? Laws. Mostly traditions that were held as law, but I mean, there's 600 and more right here in Webster County that govern county, you know, ordinances and such. But I say that to say this. As a people, there are a lot of laws out there for us to submit to. We don't have the right to drive down the road and say it's a straight road and it's 55, but, you know, it's 60 or 65 everywhere else, and I can drive 60 or 65 here too. We have no right to subvert that. We don't have the right to say, well, in this instance, I know it's okay over here, so I'll do it over there. We don't have that right. As Christian people, we have the duty to submit to our government, and luckily we live in a system where we can change that. We can, as a democratic people, we can elect, and if we want to, we can put ourselves in as the, you know, officials and change the law if we want to. But I say that to say this: we have a duty to our government to submit to it. But notice in verse 16, as it says there, as free and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as servants of God. And that's kind of hard to imagine, as I mentioned, that we use ourselves, the cloak, as we might say, you know, what are we clothed in? Galatians chapter 3. When we put on Christ, as it says there in baptism, we are in Christ. Well, we put him on, that's our cloak. We are clothed in him. Other passages, we're clothed in righteousness as we carry out what he has given us to do. We're clothed in righteousness too. So we're clothed in many different ways from this standpoint, but if we don't submit to government, as it says here, then we're using it potentially as something malicious. So we have to be thinking about that from the standpoint of submitting to our government. And like I said, it's something that I need reminded of, because I don't really particularly like the government I'm underneath right now, quite frankly. When I see the things that it does, when I see the behavior that it has, what it represents, I'm not going to mince words about it. I'm not being political. I'm just saying, for me, I just don't particularly like it. But it is who I have to submit to. It is what I have to submit to the point of what? We ought to obey God rather than man. So if my government was to say, Dan, you can't talk against, and this probably applies to Rick more than anybody because he's vocally 3 times a week speaking, but if they say, well, the government comes out and don't think it might not, and it has tried to, speak out against anything immoral. You can't speak out against that. You can't speak out against homosexuality as being immoral or sinful. Who do we obey? We obey God rather than man. That's where it crosses the line. And so that's where we may simply follow God. Submit where we do, but when it crosses the line, that's where we are to be mindful. And that's why I say keep those two passages in the back of your mind as we go through this portion of it. Lastly, honor all men. When it says, to honor, what's some other good words that we could use in reference to that?
Lift up.
Okay. Respect, lift up. What was another one I heard something else. To revere or dignify. So, we live in a world that doesn't do that, quite frankly. We live in a world that would rather tear people down and disparage them or separate, segregate. As it's mentioned before, our behavior would be very evident to those around us that we're different and that we're God's. And believe me, if you dignify people, if you respect people, honor them as it says here, all men. Now, not just the ones that come in that, I'd like to get to know him. Not that one, but the one that comes in and let's say he has a need. Okay, sometimes they don't really come in with the same reverence. All men, if we're impartial and we treat everybody the same, how much different would we be in comparison to the world? And I would say that if we just simply put in an operation as we're supposed to, the golden rule, if we operationally put that into our lives, we would honor everyone. We would treat them like we want to be treated. But unfortunately, sometimes that breaks down. And, where there's as I've looked back at every single problem that I've seen creep up in the brotherhood, if the golden rule had been in existence, that problem probably would not have came up. But unfortunately, fallible as we are, sometimes we don't put that into operation. Honor all men. Should be a pretty straightforward, easy thing to do, but we find out sometimes it's not. Love the brotherhood. Now, we talked about that back as well as being one of those things that Peter spoke of in verse 22 through 25. He instructed them in verse 22, see that ye love one another. Well, he reminds them here, very simply, as you submit to your government, do these things, honor all men, love the brotherhood. Fear God. And we talked about fear a little bit, but that being fear, being respect. Respect his authority, not only for what he can do, but we should also fear him to the extent that we want to please him. So fear him and making sure that we live our lives in such a way that he's pleased. And lastly, honor the king. And notice the king is last here. So God first, the king last, but the key is to submit. I was hoping to get through more than that, but we'll pick up there, verse 18. Any closing comments, observations?
Yeah, just one.
Yep.
He told them, this was his honor of Israel. That was a cruel,
Yeah.
evil person.
Yes.
Yet he still says honor.
Yep.
So that puts us in a predicament.
Yep.
When we don't particularly like to go with
Yep.
honor.
Yep.
And we still have to respect him.
And that's going to kind of come back in.
You have to respect the office, not
Yes.
necessarily the man.
True, and that's a real good way to put it. We don't have to agree with what they're doing morally, but if they've got authority, we have to respect that.
Going back to the honor of all people,
Mm-hmm.
reminds me of John 3:16. But even more than that, you have to look at everybody as a potential brother
True.
or sister.
True.
And if you do that, then you are going to honor them.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very true. Appreciate all that. But we'll pick up there next week. Please read through first part of chapter 3, and we'll see where we get.